Hey guys, uh, today I'm going to talk about how to publish an API endpoints with Google Cloud. Uh, so ideally, you guys must have built APIs, right? Like spend some time. What if we have to build an API and that is being consumed by multiple clients? It could be iOS or Android, or it could be web, right? So in that situation, you will ask yourself a couple of questions, right? So how can I make it secure? Is it high performant, or how can I even monitor it, right, when it is live? So today we can, basically today I'm going to talk about how we can do that with Google Cloud endpoints with minimal effort. Uh, yeah, let's see. So just for the sake of demo purposes, I'm using a very simple gRPC API. I'm going to show you the core and the output, I guess. So if you look at our profile, right? So we have a very simple endpoint which just takes a message from the user and just prints on the console. This is the RPC, and if you look at the server, the implementation is basically logging whatever user sends as an argument to the console. Let's do that. Yeah, sorry. So we have started our server, and let's look at the client. So this is the message I'm going to pass, and basically this is your endpoint, right? Like typical endpoint, how it works. Now let's imagine that this is a larger application and we have to publish to the public usage, right? So of course we can publish APIs in multiple ways but today our focus on cloud endpoints. So what are cloud endpoints, and like what is the big deal about it, right? So basically it's a distributed system which is comprised of multiple components, right? So you can do monitoring, secure an API, as well as restrict the quota usages, right? So these features comes out of the box, and this is the same infrastructure which Google uses to publish its own API. It could be your Google Plus API or admin SDK, whatever that is, right? So and this particular service is offered with something called ESP. ESP is a backend that comes like as a binary, and you can just plug in to any kind of deployment. It could be a container, it could be a VM, or it could be your app engine, or like any platform as solutions, right? So what is ESP? Right, it's an implementation of a Nginx based reverse proxy. This does all the magic for you, right? So if you are getting a request from any client or an user, it will look at the credentials and say, hey, you have access to do this, or you don't have access to do this. Yeah, as I said, you can deploy to anywhere, and also, as I said, we could do API level monitoring and logging. So if you look at the architecture, right, we have a bunch of clients here, and the load balancer is the main point, right? It could be an IP address or a DNS, and so the example we can assume like container region, just to make it easier, right? So with Kubernetes, you can like attach ESP as a sidecar. That means all your logic is here, and this is a external binary which you are deployed, and it runs standalone. If you look at the request, right, so whenever request comes from client, it crosses the load balancer, and ESP is the first entry point. So ESP does all the magic. So if you look at the lower part of the components, right? So there is something called Google Service Control. What this is part of publishing management. So in the control pane, what it does is at runtime, it checks whether a request has like rewrite permissions. Also, based on the responses, right, to the request, it will do logging and monitoring. So that recording happens through service control, and the service management is where you actually publish your API endpoint, right? So using gCloud SDK, you'll be publishing the endpoints, and the console UI is obviously where you look at your logs and monitoring metrics, right? So we can look at some of the like by default API management features, right? So as I said, like this has quota requests where you can say per user, per minute you can only have 1,000 requests. So that is an example which you can define your own scenario or use case. And at the same time, you have restriction, right? So who can access your API, right? Either do you want to make it public or do you want to make it private, and like logging, monitoring, and tracing. So with cloud endpoint, since it is part of Google Cloud offering, you can leverage the Stackdriver logging and tracing as well as monitoring by just out of the box. So if you look at the screen, right, this is the Stackdriver logging, which is a powerful interface which stores 30 days of logs by default. You basically, it's like indexed search, right? So of course you can export these logs and do more analytics using BigQuery. Then this is the tracing part of the Stackdriver. So if you look on the right hand side, right, so there is a breakdown of all the so this is an example of like a microservices architecture. Imagine these are the 4 services, and you are getting requests and responses, and each phase is captured, and like basically the representation is based on the timeline of the request, right? Then this is the UI console UI where you publish your endpoint, and if you look at the right pane, this is where you provide or rather give access to users, right? So let's say there is a company X who wants to consume your API. Unless until you give a particular access, they will not be able to use your API, right? Even though you publish it to Google library, APIs library, but only with people who have access. It's up to you. You can control that. At the same time, you get some basic out of the box metrics, right? Like what kind of requests you're seeing per minute, per day, or whatever. At the same time, the number of errors, latency, etc. Let's say you want to add more, you want to use more powerful monitoring, or you want to create alerts based on your errors. Then you could use Stackdriver's monitoring, where you can integrate with Slack or what kind of webhooks. So authentication, right? So this is the part where once you have published your API, and now how will your clients access or talk to your API, right? So by default you can use Google API keys, but it is not a recommended way because it is just a simple API key mechanism, and it does not have a fine granular way of controlling who is accessing. So if you look at the JWT, right, so this is not a typical JWT per se, right? So Google has went and implemented or rather optimized it in a certain way that each JWT token is verified against the public keys of the publisher, and it is cached in the ESP, right? We talked about ESP. So ESP caches each successful authenticated JWTs as well as the guy who is accessing, right, the client public keys. So it is rather optimized, and whichever expires first, the other one is revoked. So it starts from the scratch, right? Authentication. The other popular authentication is Auth0. So for the sake of like our discussion, we'll just like look at JWT and Google API keys. Some of the other features, right? So this is like, it's easy to integrate. You don't have to depend on any language. There is no restriction as such. Of course, if you want to use like a Python framework or Golang, so Cloud Endpoints by default provide you their own framework, which has some more like features restricted to like Google Cloud Platform, right? So let's say you don't want to do all that. You have already built an API in, let's say, like PHP, and you just want to like publish it. So all you're going to, if you look at our architecture diagram, right? So all you're going to do is plug in this sidecar, and you're all set. Then also it's like very cost effective. You just have to pay like $1 per like millions of requests, right? Again, deployment wise, you can put it on App Engine, Compute Engine, whatever. Even on the standalone instances, you can do it. So let's look at the demo. So what I've done is I've come with this like a README page. So the first part, we looked at the basic example, right? We tested that our API is working fine. The next part is we have to generate the proto file, then we have to publish our API. So let's look at that. So all we are going to do is using our proto, we are generating a stub for Cloud Endpoint services to understand the endpoint details. All right, so you can look at sorry. Yeah, it's a binary file. So next is we will look at the API config. So this is the like basic configuration if you have to publish, right? So this all we have to do is use our Google project ID. So I'm just going to replace the details here. So let's see how we can deploy this. So you can look at the details, right? So there is a particular version, and this is our service. And let's actually quickly take a look at the endpoint itself. Yeah, this is, I'm using two projects, so let's go to the original project. Yeah, so this is the screenshot I attached, right? So now, I mean, I think the whatever test I did, those results are also showing up. Maybe you can do 1 hour, right? So we don't have any data in the last 1 hour. So CODAS is something we can set up, but just for the demo purposes, I'm not showing it here. Now comes a part of permissions, right? So we have to add new user as a service consumer at the minimum so that they can use the API. So now let's, yeah, I think let me get back to the demo. Yeah, so now the next part is we have to build our code as container and push it to the server, right? So Google Cloud Builds is another Google Cloud Platform offering where it is a CI/CD solution. All you have to do is, all it does is it takes your source code, it zips it, and it sends to the remote server. and that is where your Docker build command is running, and it just tails the log here. In the meantime, I think we can go ahead and deploy our services to the container engine. So I've already created a cluster which we'll be using today for the demo. Right, so we just have to replace this image, right, in the deployment and push it to the production. Okay, so the image is ready. Yeah, so we created a Kubernetes service as well as we deployed. So we can look at this. Right, so service is still creating. We'll get an external API that we'll be using in the client, and we can look at the pods, I guess. So if you look at the description, right, so we have two containers. One is the gRPC service, right, the echo service which we have here, and the other one is the ESP. You can look at the image, right, so this is, we did not write this code. So let's test this. Okay, before we test this, we have to enable the API in the project, right? So we are client. So this is the Google's API library marketplace, right? So since the publisher has given access to the consumer, right? So we can search for it and we'll find it. Once you enable this, we also have to generate the API key to access it, right? So we'll look at the unsecure way, then maybe we'll look at how we can use it with service account. So now that the API is enabled, we can create a credential. Actually, let's do it the other way. So with the API key creation, right, so you can actually restrict the key. So in such a way that nobody can gain access to other APIs which your project has, right? So now all we need to go and select our Hello World API. So with this API key, they can only access this particular application. Even in case of like security compromise, you will not lose the control of the project. So now that we have both the IP and the API key, so we just have to replace this. Right, so we now have successfully used, right, so let's say we send a wrong API key, what will happen? Yeah, right, so it's not a valid API key. What else? Yeah, I mean, you could restrict quotas, right? I was talking about quotas. So when you enable that, right, you must have used some API after like 10 requests. They'll say you have to wait for 5 minutes or things like that, right? So you get a similar response. So since this is not a secure way, we could look at how to authenticate in like with better security, right? That is using JWT. But what Google gives you is it as something called service account. So with the help of service account, it will internally uses JWT to get a authentication token. We can actually look at that. So this is our service account email. Yeah.
This client search.
Yeah. Right. So client is the one who generates because the client has enabled the library for his project. Right. Just like any other typical Google library that you have used. Yeah. So let's look at the other API config. So this is very similar to the previous config, but it has more, right? So this is where the authentication magic is happening. So you have to set up your project ID and your service account. And initially I was talking about the public key which your JWT token uses, right? So so if you just go to this URL, sorry. I think I copied the wrong ID. Yep, I've copied the wrong ID. Yeah. Right, so if you go to this URL, so you get this public key. So every request is verified against this public key to verify that you're actually talking to your own service. Yeah, so now we have to publish this again because we're making changes to our endpoint. Oh. Okay, so now we have a new version. Let's look at the okay, sure.
Service JSON.
Yeah, the file name. Right, so if we, so if we do not provide service JSON, again, like it won't work. If you don't have permissions to this service JSON, again, it's the same situation, right? So, yeah.
Can you show this console? Sorry, UI.
Oh, yeah, right. So, we can look at requests. Right, so we can just make one more request just. I mean, it's refreshing, but okay. Hmm. 435, it's 40. Not sure why the latest locks are not showing up here. But yeah, you get the idea, right? So the request,
Scroll down, what are the metrics can you see?
yeah, you can look at the errors and like total number. Yeah, I think it showed up now, right? So the total number of responses and the latency, right? So yeah, so other things I was talking about is logs. Right, so we have the latest, okay, it's in UTC time, but yeah, it's in CST. I have to change my project time settings, I guess. anyway, you get the idea, right? So yeah, that's it actually. So it's very easy to publish API. We don't have to change the source code of your application. All you have to do is just figure out your deployment and figure out a way to plug in this ESP, right? So, and it also follows, so this cloud endpoints is basically an implementation of Open API specification, or like Swagger specification, right? So what Swagger specification says, it has a standard in how you define your endpoint and things like that. At the same time, they have built a couple of OSS tools, right, open source tools. So with that, you can generate client libraries. Let's say your application is in Ruby, your API is Ruby, right? So you want to generate a JavaScript client library. So you could just do with one command if you just follow their standard practice, and also you can generate the documentation out of the box by doing nothing. All you have to do is just get the SDK and just generate the document. Yeah, that's it. See if you have any questions.
What does ESP have on performance?
So it's
Negligible.
yeah, it's very negligible, I would say, because it's just a reverse proxy, and it is something that is written in Go, I guess, and it uses Nginx. So I would say not a whole lot.
Can service accounts be created internally by the app and not let external users know that service accounts have been created in their names? For example, if
Yeah.
I have an API, right, and you are just some client of mine, and I use GCP
Right.
with ESP, and I do not want you to know that what I use internally, so I can create service account, give you like 100 requests per minute or something, access quota and something like that, and I do that internally, totally.
You cannot automate it because you need to get their credentials, right? So you need some identification as who is your client,
Yeah,
right? As a
yeah.
publisher, you get some details,
Yeah.
but like if you are trying to guess what kind of what kind of request they are sending and things like that, then there is a restriction level, right? So you need their credentials. Or you could set a project level credentials, right? By default, you can say any of the client who tries to talk to my API can only send requests 100 requests per minute, let's say, right? So for that you don't need their credentials, but to share the API you have published, right? If they want to access your API, or let's say you also have like an offshore development team. They also want to manage your publishing control plane, then you would have to give more access to them, right? So so when it comes to publishing access permissions, it's all about how you can give access to the consumer, right? So what kind of active, like whether they can control your API or whether they can just consume your API, whether they're aliens to your API. Yeah.
For the API monitoring, I don't know whether it was just because that we had one API endpoint, but can we like monitor at individual API? Suppose you have 5 API endpoints that you're exposing, can you monitor each endpoint separately?
Yeah, I think we can do that with Stackdriver monitoring. I was telling, right? So this is the dashboard which you saw, right? It is, yeah, it's like a very simple, minimalistic representation at a high level. So if you want granular details about each of your requests, right? For example, you have like get and port request, so how much time this is taking. So then you'll have to look at the Stackdriver monitoring.
Suppose there is a use case where you have some read API endpoints and some update API endpoints. You want to expose read to, like, you want to give many people the read access, but particular people the update access. Can you generate API keys such that you can restrict only these, service accounts?
Yeah.
Should be able to access this update API endpoint.
Yeah, so right now we have opened up the API to anybody, right? So Cloud endpoint supports by default two like methods, right? If you look at REST, it has get, put, post. Similarly, there is read and write mode. So you can say who can like read or who can write.
Suppose you are here, so in REST it's an advantage because you have like post requests for updating, but gRPC you don't have like anything for.
So you have to define your endpoint, right? So so you have to go to the explicitly to the YAML file I was referring, right? So here you will actually add something called metrics, and metrics will have some limits. You can look at the implementation in this main proto. So that proto will define what kind of like configuration you can do if you have to publish the endpoint. Yeah.
If I have 2-3 services, even then I have one ESP.
No, right? So it depends. So if you have, I mean, if you are consuming 3 APIs, then it makes sense that you need to have 3 SVAs. If there is one API and 4 or 5 services are accessing this, then you don't need multiple ESPs.
Might be if you have all the 3 services deployed in the same pod, you might need only one ESP.
Yeah, it depends on the use case, right? So if you are accessing, let's say there is API A, API B and API C, then you need 3 ESPs, right? So because each ESP is configured to look at one particular project. Yeah.
You can also look at multiple containers. One ESP can look at multiple.
Yeah, so within, if you're talking about Kubernetes, right, you have to put it in a pod so that multiple containers have access to that network, right? So it really depends on how your infrastructure is set up, right? So
ESP can also manage container to container communication.
no, see, ESP is just a backend, right? Let's assume that somebody wrote everything for you, and you just plug in between your API and public, right? That is all it does. Anything that is like networking or like memory management and things like that, you have to do, right? In this case, we use Kubernetes, so by default, Kubernetes gives you that network options, right?
So you have tracing example where you have shown multiple services.
Mm-hmm.
How does that work in architecture diagram?
So if we if we look at the architecture, right? So we have this Google Service Control component. So this is basically I was talking about, right? Check and report. Check is going to look at your request and say, hey, whether you are an user, you have access or not, right? Then coming to report. Report is where it is ingesting all that log and metrics, right? So tracing also is part of that. Yeah, and explicitly you have to enable tracing in your application. That is slightly that you are plugging in an external monitoring application, so you have to make changes to the code. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, guys.